Okay, great to see you here. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the November edition of Computational Social Choice Seminar. So we are now once a month, so we can speak of a November edition. So just to remind you of how we usually run these seminars. So we have two talks, 30 minutes each. 30 minutes are roughly partitioned into 20 minutes talk, 10 minutes questions. During the talk, you can, in principle, raise your hand to ask a question to the speaker, but usually the more efficient way of doing that is to ask the question in the chat. At least for our first speaker, I believe there are co-authors in the audience who can answer the more technical questions and potentially even more discussion-oriented questions, right? So it's not unusual for us to have a lively discussion in the chat during the talk, right? So we can have a bit of that for 20 minutes and then 10 minutes for discussion proper. Right, and between the two talks, we'll have a 15-minute break, a virtual coffee break, where we will be sent to virtual rooms in much smaller groups. Now we are 43, and we'll have a much smaller number per each virtual room. Right, and that's an informal occasion, so feel free to join. Feel equally free to just, go get yourself a non-virtual cup of tea or coffee, whatever is appropriate for your time zone, and return for the second talk. So Dominic, do you want to say maybe a little bit more about the coffee breaks?
No.
No. Okay, so we will be distributed in a random or semi-random fashion. And I encourage you to join because it's fun, right? But it's also perfectly okay not to. Okay, so today's talks, I don't think we have a unified theme for the seminar today. At least I wasn't able to identify one. So our first talk is classic social choice. And our second talk is fair division. So our first speaker is Patrick Lederer from Munich, TU Munich, who will be speaking about top cycle and specifically characterizing the top cycle via strategyproofness. This is joint work with Felix Brandt, and Patrick, the floor is yours. So 20 minutes for the talk, 10 minutes for the questions. So we aim to finish at 14:35 for this talk. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Edith. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak here. It's actually quite an honor for me to speak here because many people whose work I admire also presented at this stage. But for the sake of time reasons, I will just stop presenting. So as Edith said, what I want to tell you about is a new characterization of the top cycle with strategyproofness. And this is a really classical social choice. That is, I have agents, I have alternatives. The agents have preferences over the alternatives, and now we are asked to choose a single winner of the election. And for instance, in this little toy example on the left, we could use the plurality rule with lexicographic tie-breaking, and then we see that A would be the winner of the election. Now, if you look at the middle voter here, that one is actually quite unhappy with the choice of A because it's his least preferred alternative. And thus, he might start thinking about what can he do to get a better outcome from his individual perspective. And for instance, he could report C as his best alternative, and then C would be the winner of the election. And thus, this agent has an incentive to lie because he prefers C to A, and therefore we call the plurality rule manipulable. Or more general, we say a voting rule is manipulable if a voter can benefit by lying about his true preferences. Manipulable voting rules are not appealing because, well, if we don't get the true preferences of the agents, we cannot really make a good group decision. And therefore, we're interested in strategy-proof voting rules. Now, as you might know, strategy-proof is a very restrictive property. In particular, there is the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem, which states that every strategy-proof and non-imposing voting rule is dictatorial. That's a quite strong impossibility. We don't want to give up on strategy-proofness. We don't want to give up on non-imposition, but dictatorships are not appealing for practical applications, right? And thus, the central question is on how we can get around this impossibility theory. And one possible escape route to that is to allow for sets of winners. So we may just say that instead of having being forced to pick a single winner, we allow for multiple tied winners. In the toy example in the beginning, we might just say that A, B, and C are tied for winners because they all had a plurality score of 1. And the understanding here is that we first pick a choice set containing multiple alternatives, and at a later stage, the final winner will be chosen by some tie-breaking mechanism, which might be a chairperson or a lottery. it doesn't really matter for our at that point. Now, just to very quickly recap the model. So as mentioned, we really have this classical social choice setting. That is, we have a set of alternatives, which is finite. We have a set of voters, N, also finite. And every vote has a strict preference relation over the alternatives. So no indifferences are allowed. Finally, a preference profile just contains the preference relation of every voter. And a social choice correspondence now maps every preference profile to a non-empty set of alternatives. That's the choice set from which the final winner will be elected. Two important points to note here. We assume that social choice correspondences are defined for all electorates. So that means we can add voters to the preference profile, and the social choice correspondence still must be able to handle that. We can remove voters, and the social choice correspondence must always be able to tell us the winners. On the other hand, we focus on a fixed set of alternatives, so we can't add or remove alternatives from consideration. In this setting, we want to talk about strategyproofness, and we're definitely not the first ones to consider strategyproofness for social choice correspondences. And roughly, I think there are two branches of work here. So the first one is to derive impossibilities, similar to the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem, by either using a strong strategyproofness notion or by considering restricted classes of social choice correspondences. So for instance, there's this well-known Dang and Schwartz impossibility, who get a very general impossibility by using a strong strategyproofness notion. And another example for that is Benoit's impossibility. And in contrast, Brandt and Geist, for instance, just focus on the narrow class of majoritarian social choice functions and show with these an impossibility based on a quite weak strategyproofness notion. The other, probably less known approach is to actually get positive results by considering weak enough strategyproofness notions. So for instance, Needing found some positive results for Brandt and Brill. And we really talked about very weak strategyproofness notions such as Kelly strategyproofness. But at least there are some positive results here. Now, if you look at these results in terms of strategyproofness, we actually see that there's quite a big gap. For positive results, we have these very weak notions. And for negative results, we have this usually quite strong notions, which kind of leads to the questions, how can we fill the gap, right? And one way to fill that gap is to consider the notion of Fishburn strategyproofness, because it's not super weak, but still weak enough to get positive results, but it's not really well understood. And that's why we focused on this notion of Fishburn strategyproofness, which I will explain in a minute in more detail. And based on this notion, we show two quite strong results, I think. The first one is the characterization of the top cycle. And we show that the top cycle is the only pairwise social choice correspondence that satisfies Fishburn strategyproofness and two auxiliary axioms called set non-imposition and homogeneity. And in our second result, we slightly generalize this characterization by dismissing the condition of set non-imposition and using neutrality and non-imposition instead. If we do that, we end up with these robust dominant set rules, which are quite similar to the top cycle. Now, to really understand these results, let's go over the axioms. And maybe the most restrictive axiom is pairwiseness in these characterizations. And along pairwiseness, I will also introduce the concept of majoritarian social choice correspondences. The idea of these two axioms is to compare alternatives pairwisely. So, and for that, I want to first introduce the support between two alternatives. And that is really just the number of voters who prefer X to Y. So in this little example here, the support for B against C is 3 because voters 1, 2, and 4 prefer B to C. Based on the support, we can also define majority margins. That is the difference between the supports, and therefore they intuitively tell us how many more voters prefer X to Y than Y to X. So in our example, the majority margin between B and C would be 2. Because, well, 3 voters prefer B to C and 1 voter prefers C to B, and we take the difference. Finally, there is the majority relation, which just contains all pairs of alternatives where we have a non-negative majority margin. So for instance, the pair BC would be in the majority relation because the majority margin is non-negative, and therefore we say that B majority dominates C, but CB is not in the majority relation, or C does not majority dominate B, because the majority margin here is negative. Now, since we talk about a relation here, we can nicely illustrate this, the majority relation by just the graph. So we can just draw an edge from an alternative x to another alternative y if x weakly majority dominates y. That is why we have an edge from B to C here. And for instance, between A and B, we see we have this bidirectional edge because A weakly majority dominates B and B weakly majority dominates A. The weights here are just the majority margins. And based on this graphical representation, it's quite easy to define the notion of majoritarian and pairwise social choice correspondences. And social choice correspondence is majoritarian if it only depends on the majority relation. That is, if I have two preference profiles with the same majority relation, I have to return the same choices for these profiles. And this class is quite well known. There are many social choice correspondences in there, like Copeland's rule, the B-partisan set, the uncovered set, the top cycle, minimal covering set, and many more. A generalization of that are pairwise social choice correspondences, which can additionally depend on the majority margins. So now we, or more formally, a social choice correspondence is pairwise if for any two profiles with the same majority margins for all alternatives, we return the same choice set. And again, this class is very large. We have, for instance, Borders rule in here, rank pairs, Schulz's rule. There is a recently developed split cycle, Kamenet's rule. So there are a lot of things in these classes. Now, in this pairwise world, there's one particular situation where it's quite clear what alternative you want to choose, and that is if there's a cornercy winner. So I think most people know what a cornercy winner is. It's an alternative that just majority dominates every other alternative. So for instance, in the left majority relation, B is the cornercy winner. And since the idea of this pairwise function is to use these pairwise comparisons between alternatives, it is natural to choose the cornercy winner whenever one exists. And we call a social choice correspondence which does that a cornercy extension. Now, as you already see in the definition, a cornercy winner is not guaranteed to exist. So for instance, we have this case in the right majority relation where every alternative has an incoming edge. And so cornercy extensions, there are profiles where cornercy extensions are not, where it's not really clear what we should do. To address this issue of non-existence, we can generalize the notion of the cornercy winner to set-valued concepts called dominant sets. A dominant set is a set of alternatives such that every alternative in X majority dominates every alternative outside of X. So kind of that's really just a generalization of the cornercy winner to sets. And the nice thing is that dominant sets are guaranteed to exist because the set of all alternatives is trivially dominant. And therefore, we can now define the concept of dominant set rules, which are always required to return dominant sets. On the other hand, dominant sets are not unique. So for instance, in the right graph here, the set ABC is dominant, but also the set ABCDE is dominant. So we kind of have a choice of what to do. But the nice thing is that dominant sets are ordered by set inclusion. That is, there's really a unique smallest dominant set. And therefore, we can just define the social choice correspondence, which returns always the smallest dominant set, and that is the top cycle. So what's really colored here in these two majority relations is the outcome of the top cycle, which are by definition two dominant sets. Now, that is kind of one half of the important axioms which we need. The other half is strategyproofness. And we actually face a little problem here because what is only submit preferences over the alternatives, but we require them to compare sets of alternatives, right? That's necessary for defining strategyproofness. And for addressing this problem, we use Fishburn's set extension. And according to the set extension, a voter prefers a set X to another set Y if he prefers every alternative that is in X but not in Y to every alternative that is in Y. And he prefers every alternative that is in X to every alternative that is in Y but not in X. Now, that sounds very mathematically. What it's easiest to imagine that the set Y is currently chosen, and we want to go to the set X. And then this just means that every alternative which is newly added to the choice set is better than every alternative currently chosen. And every alternative that drops out of the choice set is worse than every alternative that's chosen once we move to X. Let's look at a small example. So we have one voter here. He has a lexicographic preference relation. So A is preferred to B, to C, to D, and to E. And now we can see which sets the voter can compare. And for instance, the voter prefers the set ABC to the set BCD because it prefers A to BCD. So that's the first condition. And he prefers the set all alternatives in ABC to D, which satisfies the second condition. On the other hand, the voter cannot compare the sets ABD and CDE. And this is due to the fact that, so it's quite obvious that the voter does not prefer CDE to ABD, and he does not prefer ABD to the set CDE because he prefers C to D, and C is not chosen in the left in the blue set. So the second condition here is violated. Nevertheless, I still think that intuitively, at least, ABD seems better than CDE. And this just shows that this Fishburn set extension is a quite weak way to extend voters' preferences to sets of alternatives. And consequently, the notion of Fishburn strategyproofness is also quite weak. Fishburn strategyproofness requires that no voter is able to lie in such a way that he prefers the outcome when lying to the outcome when telling the truth according to Fishburn's set extension. As mentioned, that is a very weak strategyproofness notion, and it's also quite natural strategyproofness notion, because this arises if we assume that there's a chairperson who breaks the tie according to his lexicographic preference relation, and which is unknown to the voters, and voters are completely risk averse. Then they would exactly behave according to Fishburn's set extension. So these are our two main axioms. We need two more. We need a few more axioms, which I hope that most of you know. The first one is non-imposition. Non-imposition just requires that every alternative can be chosen as unique winner for some preference profile. In the context of single-valued social choice functions, that's really just requires that every alternative can be the winner. In the context of social choice correspondences, that is still very reasonable, because it just states that, because for instance, if all voters agree on a best alternative, then we should probably choose that as the winner of the election. Nevertheless, you might argue that non-imposition is not the right generalization of right way of defining this for social choice correspondences. We can also consider set non-imposition, which just requires that every set of alternatives can be chosen for a preference profile. So that's really just generalizing non-imposition to sets now. Another well-known axiom, I hope, is homogeneity. So recall here that we talked about variable electorates, and homogeneity is just a weak consistency condition now. That says, so we get a preference profile, and now we clone every voter and his preference relation. And by doing that, we don't get any information, right? And therefore, the choice set should also not change. And that is what's basically written down here. As fourth constraint, we have neutrality. I think everybody knows that. That just means alternatives should be treated equally, or more formally, if we permute the alternatives in the preference profile, we should also permute them in the choice set. And lastly, we have this notion of robust dominant set rules in theorem 2, and robustness here is just an additional requirement which basically formalizes that the dominant set rule behaves in a good way. And the idea here is that if I have two preference profiles R and R prime, and the choice set of f of R is also dominant in R prime, then F should choose a subset of f of R for R prime. So basically, if we, for instance, swap two unchosen alternatives in R, that should not affect the choice set. Or if we swap two chosen alternatives, then we can only get a smaller choice set. These types of things are formulated by robustness. Okay, now we should be able to understand our results. And the first thing which we can now see is that our results actually turns the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem into a characterization of the top cycle by moving from single-valued social choice functions to set-valued social choice correspondences. That is, strategyproofness for single-valued rules becomes to Fishburn strategyproofness, non-imposition turns into set non-imposition, and we get these two additional requirements of homogeneity and pairwiseness, And then instead of characterizing dictatorships, we characterize the top cycle. Now, our second result is just more general in its flavor. We drop set non-imposition and use neutrality and standard non-imposition instead. And then we end up with this robust dominant set rules. And again, this behaves similar to the top cycle. We always have to choose a dominant set, but we can choose a larger one. So for instance, the quantity rule, which chooses the quantity winner if there is one, and all alternatives if there's no quantity winner is, for instance, a robust dominant set rule. And by the theorem, we know that it's Fishmans Strategyproof. Okay, now, these results are nice, I think, but they also have a large number of implications. In particular, if we focus on the setting of homogeneous, non-imposing, neutral, and pairwise choice correspondences, then we get a lot of things. For instance, then strategyproofness implies majoritarianness. This is due to the fact that every robust dominant set rule must be majoritarian. And this is maybe surprising because pairwiseness actually allows to use the majority margins, but strategyproofness now requires that we cannot use them with, and end up with these majoritarian rules which only rely on the majority relation. Next up is strategyproofness is in our setting actually equivalent to group strategyproofness because these robust dominant set rules are actually even group strategyproof. So there's not really a difference here. Similarly, we use this rather weak notion of Fishburn strategyproofness, but these robust dominant set rules are quite resilient to strategic behavior, especially with the top cycle. And this means just that many strategyproof notions actually coincide given our assumptions. Lastly, even without using set non-imposition, given these four assumptions written down here, we see that the top cycle is the finest strategyproof choice correspondence. So, which also shows that the top cycle is probably the best choice among all these functions, even if you don't use set non-imposition. And as last point, as you may know, the top cycle is not Pareto optimal, and because the top cycle is the finest robust dominant set rule, no other robust dominant set rule is Pareto optimal. So we really have an impossibility actually. However, I just want to mention that one can actually fix this issue by first kicking out all Pareto optimal alternatives and then computing the top cycle. This satisfies all our exams, but pairwiseness because you cannot compute the Pareto dominant alternatives based on the majority margins alone. That's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. So let's give Patrick a round of applause. So we already have some discussion in the chat when Felix Brandt is bravely kind of answering the questions that come at him from different directions. So Patrick, I'll give you a bit of time to see what's happening there. So, but just to check, so Ulla, Dominic, do you have your questions answered by Felix, or is there room for further discussion there?
Yeah, so I asked about whether homogeneity is the only variable electorate axiom, and Felix answered pairwiseness is also one. That's true. Can you comment more about why you need to be in a variable electorate setting? Is it only due to pairwiseness?
It's mainly due to pairwiseness. So what you get by being in this variable electorate setting and having pairwiseness is that you can strengthen strategyproofness quite a lot. So say a voter tries to manipulate by reinforcing A against B. What we can now do, since we're in a variable electorate and have this pairwiseness notion, is we can just add two voters with inverse preferences. That does not affect the majority margins and therefore not the outcome, and let him reinforce A against B. And now we can reorder all the other alternatives and therefore get stronger notions of strategyproofness, or get more out of strategyproofness. That's why this is important.
Interesting, thank you.
And now Ulla's question, so is that, so Ulla, do you want to maybe tell others?
So it was very helpful what Felix said, but let me just, as we seem to be short of questions, so it was about this set non-imposition. Just at first, it sounded not very, attractive to me, because non-imposition, usually you explain it by saying, well, just imagine everybody has exactly the same ordering. Of course, the top alternative should win. So that you get that from non-imposition, or that implies non-imposition, that you want that. And then for set non-imposition, I don't see a natural counterpart. But then I remember that you have weak preferences. So you could have the case where everybody has the exact same little set at the top. Is that your justification for this axiom, or do you have something else in mind?
Okay, first of all, we don't have weak preferences, we have strict ones. So
okay.
That does not work. I
misunderstood.
But probably good to clarify that. And actually the reason is the variable electorate. Because what you can do by this variable electorate is just basically achieving neutrality between all the alternatives you want and place them above all of the other alternatives you don't want to have chosen, right? So you can kind of construct profiles where all alternatives in the choice sets just seem equally good. And then it seems very natural to just choose all of them, and all of them are even strictly better than all alternatives that are not chosen. So you kind of can partition the profile into good alternatives and bad ones, but just permutating them and choosing a large enough profile.
But then you would get from neutrality and Pareto, you would also get that.
Exactly.
But you don't have Pareto. Okay, yeah.
So we don't have Pareto, so that does not really work. But in this pairwise, so if you want pairwise neutrality and some glimpse of efficiency, you can weaker things than Pareto. Then you already end up with the set non-imposition, and that's why I think that's still natural to require.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so perhaps one question from me. So I appreciate that 20 minutes is only barely enough to explain the axioms and the results, and you've done that very clearly. But if you'd like to spend a minute or two talking about your techniques, how to actually prove these theorems, is it manual? Is it kind of using ILP solvers, set solvers, just a flavor?
It is manual, and it's quite a lot of effort to do that, because you want to get away from preference profiles. So that's kind of the first thing you want to do. You want only to talk a reason about the majority relation, or the weighted majority relation, and what happens if I change weights here. And then you start arguing why things work. And what's kind of the difficult thing to do here is to show that you need to be a dominant set group if you satisfy the axioms, because that's very non-obvious. Even though it might feel obvious. And what you actually have shown here is that if you, so we basically show two things. If you always include the top cycle in the choice set, then you are a dominant, you need to be a dominant set group given all the axioms. And given all the axioms, and every social choice correspondence that satisfies all axioms satisfies this condition. And therefore we get that we have a dominant set group.
Okay, thanks for explaining. And I think we have a question from Klaus. I see a raised hand. Klaus, feel free. You may want to unmute yourself and ask.
Yes, thanks, Patrick. I have one question and one remark. One question is, you had some one brief sentence on a risk aversion interpretation of the Fishburn strategyproofness. I wasn't quite sure what it was, and it wasn't quite obvious to me it did what you said. So question is, could you explain that? Second remark is on the Pareto and the pairwiseness. If you know the if you know the number of agents, then Pareto can be expressed in terms of majority margin. So somehow the notion of pairwiseness asks you to forget that. Isn't that version? We can turn it as a question. Now, if you if you weaken pairwiseness to controlling to an extent where keeping the margins constant and the population size constant, then you would get a larger class. Your axioms would be weaker. Can you say something about that?
Right. So you're completely right. We don't have exactly Pareto optimality because we work with this variable electorate thing, and we kind of don't know the number of agents because we really just focus on the margins, and there you lose this information of how many voters there are. if we consider this larger class where we know the number of agents, that's also a class known in the literature, then the problem is that the trick with adding voters doesn't work anymore. That's why the proofs break down. It's still, nevertheless, it still seems that you can that you get similar results here, in the sense that that you end up with things similar to these dominant set rules. That is, for instance, you can kick out the Pareto dominant alternatives at first step and then computer dominant set rule on what remains. That's also Fishburn strategy proof and satisfies all other axioms and this weaker notion of pairwiseness. And therefore, you might, this seems at least very like a nice approach to get stronger results, but the problem here is on how you want to prove things, because, or how you can prove things, because you kind of lose a fair bit of strength in strategyproofness because of that. So the combination of strategyproofness and pairwiseness gives you more power in what strategyproofness implies, and you lose that because you cannot really just say, okay, we reorder now, and that's the problem here. And the second question on the Fishburn set extension, so the idea of a Fishburn set, or one possible interpretation of that is, so we assume you have a chairperson who has his own preference relation, strict transitive as just as every other voter, but the voters don't know this preference relation. And now this chairperson uses this, his preference, just chooses from the choice set the best alternative according to his preference relation. And we get now Fishburn set extension if we say that voters only are willing to manipulate if they get a better outcome, regardless of the preference of how the preference relation of the chairperson looks like. That's what I meant with risk awareness.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so I think that concludes our time slot for this talk. So thanks again, Patrick, for a very clear talk and a nice discussion. So I suggest unmuting ourselves. Another round of applause. Okay, and now we have 10 minutes for the coffee break and socializing. So back around something 45, whatever your time zone is, 45. So it seems that enough of us are back. So I think we're ready to start our second talk of the day. So different topic, and I think I also noticed some change in the audience. So our second speaker is Maria Kyropoulou. So Maria, feel free to start sharing your slides. So she will be talking about interim NV3 allocation lotteries, so an NV3ness talk. So this is joint work with Yannis Karkianis and Panagiotis Kanelopoulos. I think at least Panagiotis is in the audience. I haven't seen Yannis yet. I'm not sure if he is, right? So just like last time, we can hope to have people answering questions in the chat while the speaker is speaking. Okay, so same format, 20 plus 10. So Maria, feel free to start.
Yes, thank you, Edith. Thank you for inviting me. Indeed, Panagiotis is in the audience. Yannis can't make it, unfortunately, today. Thanks for the introduction. I am Maria Kyropoulou. I am going to talk about interim NV3 allocation lotteries and present joint work with Ioannis Karagiannis and Panagiotis Kanelopoulos, like Edith mentioned. So, sorry. Okay, so we focus on a fair allocation context of indivisible goods, which means we have a set of items that we want to distribute to a set of agents. And we assume that agent I appreciates item J according to some cardinal value Vij. Also, we assume that a bundle of items, if an agent is allocated a bundle of items, then that bundle of items is worth to that agent the sum of the individual item values that that agent has. So a central notion in this context is the notion of NV3ness. which implies that no agent prefers the bundle allocated to another agent. So let's see a toy example of these, although I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. So in this setting, we have in this instance, we have three agents, think of them as kids, and 4 toys that we would like to distribute to the kids. So the numbers here correspond to the preferences of the kids over the toys, which means that Blue, for example, would most like to get the car, then he would rather get the puppet, and finally he'd like the camera a bit less, but he doesn't care at all about getting the baby doll. On the other hand, Orange and Yellow would be equally happy with getting either of the car, the baby doll, or the puppet. It shouldn't take long to identify an envy-free allocation in this instance. So in particular, let's see this one here. So let's assume that Blue gets the car, which means that the allocation of Blue is the car. And then Orange gets the camera and the baby doll. So the allocation of Orange is the camera and the baby doll. And Yellow gets the puppet. So all toys are allocated. And to see that, for example, Blue doesn't envy Orange, we compare the value of Blue for the bundle that Blue is getting, which is the car, and that is 20. And we compare it with the value that Blue would have by getting the bundle allocated to Orange, which is the camera and the baby doll. And Blue would get value 10 plus 0 for that bundle, which means that Blue doesn't envy Orange. So a similar inequality is satisfied for every ordered pair of agents in our instance, which implies that this allocation is envy-free. However, as we already know, envy-free allocations are not guaranteed to exist. And this is actually shown here. If we just remove the puppet from our instance, if we assume that the puppet is not available as a toy to distribute, then we get an instance that doesn't admit any envy-free allocation. So indeed, we can see that for an envy-free allocation, Orange and Yellow should get either the car or the baby doll, should get an item for which they have strictly positive value, which leaves the camera for Blue. However, Blue, if they get the camera, then they would definitely envy the person that gets the car. So in this instance, envy-free allocations do not exist. A straightforward idea to bypass such a limitation of non-existence of envy-free deterministic allocations would be to use randomness and consider random allocations. And this is definitely not a new idea. Ex-ante envy-freeness is a well-known notion of fairness in the context of random allocations. And we say that probability distribution over allocations, which we will also refer to as a lottery from now on, we say that the lottery is ex-ante envy-free if no agent prefers another agent's allocation on average. So this property is trivially guaranteed by allocating each item to each agent uniformly at random. However, such an allocation is not exactly meaningful in a fair allocation context, which makes this the notion of ex-ante envy-freeness appear a bit too weak. The other extreme variant of envy-freeness in random allocation is the context of ex post envy-freeness. So we say that the lottery is ex post envy-free if every deterministic allocation in the support of the lottery is deterministically envy-free. However, this is too restrictive. It doesn't really help us bypass any limitation, for example, the non-existence of envy-free allocations, because an instance that doesn't admit a deterministic envy-free allocation definitely doesn't admit a probability distribution. over deterministic envy-free allocations. So this brings us to the notion of interim envy-freeness, which is defined as follows. So a lottery is interim envy-free if for each agent, and given the bundle allocated to that agent, the agent doesn't prefer another agent's allocation on average. And this average, this expectation, is taken conditioned on the allocation of the agent that we are considering. Okay, so let's say an example here. So in our example, an interim envy-free allocation would have the following two allocations in its support. So with probability 1/2, blue would get the camera, orange would get the car, and yellow would get the baby doll. And with the remaining probability, blue would get the camera, orange would get the baby doll, and then yellow would get the car. So we see that blue's allocation is fixed. We know exactly what blue is doing, what blue will get. However, the allocation of orange and yellow is random. To see what interim envy-free constraints look like, if we focus on blue, we'll see that the interim envy-free constraints that have to be satisfied so that blue doesn't interim envy someone else very much look like ex-ante envy-free constraints, and that is because the allocation of blue is fixed. So when we compare the value of blue for a given allocation to the expected value of another bundle for conditioned on that allocation is like taking an ex-ante constraint. However, if we want to see whether orange interim envies another agent, we should fix its allocation to both the car and the baby doll separately, because these are the two bundles or items in this case that orange is getting with positive probability, and then compare the value of orange for the fixed allocation with the expected value that orange would have on the random bundle allocated to another agent, okay? Given the fact that, in this case, orange gets the car. So in this particular instance, because the instance is small, we can observe that fixing the allocation of orange fully determines the allocation of everyone else. So fixing the allocation of orange to car, let's say, allows us to focus on the green allocation here, and essentially the expected value of orange over the random bundle of B is not really an expected value over a random bundle, is a fixed value over a deterministic bundle. So we focus on the green allocation. More generally and more formally, here is the definition of interim envy-freeness. So a lottery over allocations is interim envy-free if for each pair of agents I, K, and any bundle AI that I gets, I's value is at least her expected value for the bundle of K, conditioned on the fact that I gets the bundle AI that we have specified. So the value of I for a fixed deterministic bundle AI that I gets with positive probability has to be at least equal to the expected value of I for the random bundle of another agent conditioned on I's allocation. Okay, so this serves as middle ground between ex post and ex ante envy-freeness, because as our example demonstrated, this notion is easier to achieve than ex post envy-freeness, while it offers a more meaningful fairness guarantee than ex ante envy-freeness. So before I proceed to mention our results, let me just briefly mention some previous work on fairness in random allocations. So the papers by Alexandrov et al., Freeman et al., and Aziz consider and study ex post and ex ante fairness constraints in different contexts, and whether they are satisfied possibly simultaneously. While interim envy-freeness as a notion has appeared and was first studied by Palfrey and Srivastava and has appeared in other papers like Gaidos, Talon, and de Clipel, while the context there in all these papers is very different to ours, which essentially distinguishes our work from theirs. And the results that I'm going to talk about are essentially the first results analyzing interim envy-freeness in a fair allocation context. So I will only give a high-level overview of our results. We provide a series of results on different aspects of interim envy-freeness. We first relate interim envy-freeness to other fairness notion known for deterministic allocations. We provide and we analyze trade-offs with economic efficiency and provide bounds on the inefficiency that is caused by requiring this fairness guarantee. These bounds take the form of price of interim envy-freeness results. With respect to computing interim envy-free lotteries, we know that such questions are typically NP-hard in the general case, but focusing our attention to matching instances where the number of items is equal to the number of players allows us to manage to compute interim envy-free lotteries that actually optimize different social welfare notions in polynomial time. So we consider utilitarian social welfare, egalitarian social welfare, and log Nash social welfare too. And also our price of interim envy-freeness results also capture different notions of social welfare. I am going to elaborate just a bit more on the algorithmic result in a minute, but first let me just finish with the overview of the results that are in the paper. So far we've only discussed interim envy-freeness notion when no payments are involved. So in the paper we also extend the notion to account for payments and define interim envy-free pairs of lotteries and accompanying payments, where we consider three different types of payments. We consider payments that are agent dependent, we consider payments that are bundle dependent, and unconstrained payments that depend on both the agent and the allocation. So in the context of interim envy-freeness with payments, we define two optimization problems that are inspired by subsidy minimization and rent division. So in subsidy minimization, the goal is to compute a pair, an interim envy-free pair of lottery, of allocation lottery, and payments to the agents. That's why we call them subsidies. That's why they are called subsidies. And the goal is to minimize the total sum of payments that have to be made to the agents so that our pair is interim envy-free. In the utility maximization problem, which resembles the rent division problem for interim envy-free allocations, again, the goal is to find an interim envy-free pair of lottery and accompanying payments. But in this case, the payments are made from the agent for the goods. The payments have to sum up to a specific rent value, and the goal is to maximize the minimum expected utility of an agent. So in the context of these two optimization problems, we contrast agent-based payments and bundle-based payments and demonstrate that both definitions are meaningful in the sense that none of these two types of payments clearly is superior to the other in every case. And we also have an algorithmic result about computing approximate interim envy-free lotteries with unconstrained payments, again for matching instances. So our algorithmic results follow the same template, the same methodology, the same roadmap in their proof. And even though a lot of details have to be fine-tuned, because it's the same template that is being used to prove, to compute interim envy-free allocations without payments for a set of different social welfare objectives. And it's the same methodology that we also use to compute approximate IEF lotteries with payments for these two optimization problems. So the methodology, the template is the same, and I am going to give a very high-level overview of it. But again, of course, a lot of details need to be specified to manage to get the result in each of these separate cases. So we take a linear programming approach to these problems, which means that we formulate the problem as a linear program. The problem is always, as I said, to compute an interim envy-free allocation. In some cases, we are also looking for payments. This means that we have a linear program has one variable for each possible matching, which gives us an exponential number of variables. So next we compute the dual linear program, which has polynomially many variables, but exponentially many constraints. We know, however, that this is not prohibitive, and we know that linear programs like this one can be solved efficiently if only we had access to an oracle, such that given values, given an allocation of values to the dual variables, it can return in polynomial time a violating constraint, or respond correctly that no violating constraint exists. So if we had access to such a separation oracle, we use the ellipsoid algorithm to solve the dual, and this would immediately give us an answer to the primal, to our original linear program. So it turns out that the separation oracle that we'd like to solve this problem takes the form of an optimization problem, a variant of perfect bipartite matching problem, where the weights are defined over ordered edge pairs. So to the best of our knowledge, this is a novel variant of this optimization problem. And again, we managed to solve it using a linear programming approach. One might be tempted to use known results by Birk von Neumann for decompositions of doubly stochastic matrices. However, they couldn't be applied in this context, because in this context, there is one additional symmetry constraint that we were after. And luckily for us, there was a result in the literature by Creuset, which helps us do exactly that, which does decompositions of doubly stochastic matrices, satisfying an additional symmetric constraint. So we believe that this could be of independent interest. A linear programming approach is used here as well to show that this is solved in polynomial time. And we use it as a separation oracle to get a solution for computing interim envy-free allocations or interim envy-free pairs, like we discussed. So this is more or less what I wanted to say. I didn't get into any details about the proofs, but I'm happy to discuss them if you want now or at any other point. So to wrap up, we analyzed interim envy-free allocations on a fair allocation context, and we provided several structural and computational results. There are several open questions from our work. There are specific gaps that remain open. Of course, it would be also very nice to get algorithmic results that are based on combinatorial algorithms and avoid using the linear programming approach. And also, even though we do provide some algorithmic results, there are still questions whose complexity we still don't know how to answer. So we have, for example, computed interim NV3 allocations with accompanying unconstrained payments for the two optimization problems, but we really don't know the complexity of focusing on different types of payments. So yes, that is all. Thank you very much for attending.
Okay, thanks, Maria. So I suggest unmuting our microphones and giving a round of applause. So we've already had some conversation in the chat. So one had to do about the relationship between interim NV3 and proportionality. I think that was answered by Panagiotis. So Errol, are you okay with that answer, or do you want to follow through on that?
Oh yes, it's fine.
Right. And yes, so there was a question by Nisarg. So interim EFX and whether it always exists. Okay, so Maria, Panagiotis, so what are your thoughts?
So we haven't really thought about it. We haven't really worked on answering this question. However, this defining the interim variant of notions weaker than NV3ness does appear as we have mentioned it as a possible extension even in the paper, but we didn't really consider it. No.
Thank you.
Thanks. And yeah, so that was actually quite of answered. Right, and then we have the last question in the chat. So by Tahar Alush. So Tahar, would you perhaps do you want to perhaps ask it in person?
My question is about the definition of this notion of NV3ness. And so you fix an agent bundle. So it's you condition with regards to this bundle, and you average with regards to the other agents bundle. So my question is, would the results drastically change if it were defined the other way around? So
okay, so if I understand correctly, you're saying that in order to understand if I interim NVU, I would consider my expected value conditioned on your bundle.
Exactly.
And I would have many interim constraints, as many interim constraints as are the possible bundles in your allocation.
Yes.
Okay, so give me a minute to think about it. It does sound like entirely different. I'm just trying to think if it is too restrictive in the sense. So in our example, it doesn't give us a lot of intuition because it's a small example in the example in the paper. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the results would drastically change because it's an entirely different definition, but at the moment, I don't have an intuition about how it would change.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, further questions from the audience? Raise your hand, speak up, start typing, whichever format you prefer. Okay, we've got a question from Dominic. Oh no, that's a comment. Yeah. Dominic, do you want to expand on that?
Not really.
Right, so the interpretation here would be what? So you have observed So you know that items allocate according to a distribution. You observe what someone else got. You don't yet know what your share is going to be. And yeah, you are not envious.
Yeah, it's kind of strange to also motivate it in a sense that interim NV3, you observe what you get, but you don't observe yet what everybody else got. So what would the equivalent of the opposite definition be? How can you observe what someone else got before observing your own? Yeah, I guess it could make sense in some context. Yeah, I haven't really given any thought to interim effects, so I don't want to comment on what Dominic said. Sorry.
Okay, so we've got a raised hand from Sid. Go ahead, ask.
Hey, hi. So I guess one way to look at interim NV-freeness is it's an analog of, intuitively, it's an analog of correlated equilibrium. Like you're looking at a conditional distribution and then saying that you don't have NV. So I was wondering if there's a weaker, I'm even weakening it to now consider coarse correlated equilibrium. So I'm not looking at the conditional distribution. I'm just saying I pick any pair of agents, I and J, and then J swaps with I for all possible draws or realizations. Is that something that's also ruled out by your examples? So it's again like something that's between complete like ex ante NV-free and something weaker than interim, but say stronger than ex ante. So do you have examples that rule such results out?
We don't have examples. That's a good idea. I mean, it's a weaker notion, and it could make sense to consider it if we manage to, guarantee existence. Because even for interim NV-free, we can't guarantee existence. So considering a weaker notion could make sense. Thank you. But we don't have examples to contradict that.
And the matching result you have is for additive valuations. So
yes, all the results are for additive values.
But because there are only M agents and N goods, I mean, everything is additive. It doesn't make sense to talk about it beyond additive because it's just unit demand agents, or am I missing something? So I'm saying, are there...
So the computational results are on matching instances.
Right.
And most of our examples are on matching instances because it happened, but because some of the results are negative, I mean, it doesn't really matter if they're matching. So you can think of it as most results are general, apart from the computational results that have to apply on matching instances.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so any further questions from the audience? Okay, so we are at the end of our time slot for this talk. So it's 30 minutes since Maria started. So perhaps another round of applause. Okay, so that concludes the two talks for today. And now Ulla would like to announce the next seminar, the December edition. Ulla?
Indeed, I would like to announce the December edition. So we're going to continue to meet once a month on the second Tuesday of the month at the usual time. And we have two speakers lined up for the 9th of December, Thursday, the 9th of December. Yannis Karagiannis will talk about learning approval-based multi-winner voting rules and the complexity of doing so. And Errol Segal Halevi will talk about fair division of electricity, and we'll find out what all of that means in a month's time. So I look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah, thanks, Ulla. I think that's all for today. Thanks everyone for coming. So see you in December.
Thank you.